Hello, all. Week 8, Manifest Destiny. I'm going to talk a little bit here about, again, Manifest Destiny. It'll touch upon actually many of the topics that are part of the questions for this week. Manifest Destiny, Oregon, California, Texas, a little bit on the Mexican-American War, and of course, one of the more important presidents in our history, one that's often left behind, James Polk. So let's get started. So Manifest Destiny. Now, Manifest Destiny is a term coined by John O'Sullivan in an 1839 article entitled The Great Nation of Futurity. I want to share a quote from that because it encapsulates much of what we think of when we think of Manifest Destiny, kind of its impact on our nation, the focus on destiny, obviously, on American exceptionalism. Again, not the idea America's better, just that it's different, nationalism, and just basic American principles. And again, the idea that this was a task that was given to us by God, that this was kind of a larger purpose here, not just the material world, but again, God's purpose for the American people. So here's the quote from O'Sullivan. The American people have derived their origin from many other nations, and the Declaration of Independence being entirely based on the great principle of human equality, these facts demonstrate at once our disconnected position as regards any other nation, that we have in reality but little connection with the past history of any of them, and still less with all antiquity, its glories, or its crimes. Interesting last sentence there. And going on, another quote from the article, in the light of truth has America been chosen, and her high example shall smite unto death the tyranny of kings, hierarchs, and oligarchs, and carry the glad tidings of peace and goodwill, where myriads now endure an existence scarcely more enviable than that of beasts of the field. Who then can doubt that our country is destined to be the great nation of futurity? So again, that's O'Sullivan to us today. It may sound arrogant, it may sound kind of trite, but back then this was important. And again, this is part of this is something that fueled the race toward the West. This is something that fueled the expansion of the nation. Again, that last sentence of the first quote, I love. These facts demonstrate at once our disconnected position as regards any other nation, that we have in reality but little connection with the past history of any of them, and still less with all antiquity, its glories, or its crimes. Maybe some of you have taken a logic class. You can kind of tear that sentence apart. So let's get to the West. Now, nothing in United States history has captured the popular imagination like the settlement of the American West. Even as it was taking place, the adventures of a host of desperados, lawmen, explorers, and Indian fighters were chronicled in books and magazines published in the East. The new movie industry produced, obviously not in the 1800s, but later, the new movie industry would produce numerous westerns featuring heroes of the purest heart and villains so dastardly they tied innocent damsels to railroad tracks and left them to die. The reality of the West, though, was quite different from the Hollywood portrayal. Probably the biggest myth of the West is the idea of the Western settler as a rugged individualist who set out to tame the wilderness with his or her bare hands. Now, this is true to an extent. Individualism was kind of a core ideal, and compared to the niceties of the East or what we see in Europe, settling the West was much more difficult, and it took a certain type of person. But regardless, one of the things to remember is the government played a vital role in exploring and settling the West. It provided land grants to the railroads to subsidize their construction, and many of the explorers and surveyors of the West were trained at the U.S. Military Academy and paid by the government for their work. The government also gave land to settlers and provided them with military assistance and protection. Army outposts were a source of supplies, shelter, and information to settlers. So the government does help. But again, there is individualism at play, and it's not like anybody could just go and plant themselves in the West and help to settle it. Now, there was a substantial influx of people from Asia, especially China and later Japan. Many of them were brought over to work on the railroads, and they later settled down and founded their own communities. There was already a substantial Hispanic population in the West, the descendants of early Spanish settlers. Many of the newly freed slaves also moved west. The largest portion of them settled as farmers in Kansas, but others continued further west. In general, African Americans had greater opportunities to earn a living and advance themselves socially in the West than they did in either the northern or southern halves of the East. Now, that's kind of, I mean, this discussion kind of, it doesn't stop here in the early 1800s. Obviously, that includes part of postbellum America, or what happens after the Civil War. But even early on, even before the Civil War, African Americans did migrate west, and why wouldn't you? Rather than face the wrath of Southerners, or even deal with those in the East who also had their proclivity toward prejudice. Freed African Americans, whether they were slaves who purchased their own freedom, whether they were slaves who were set free, or whether they were just free African Americans, they would migrate again to areas where they had more opportunity and where they were not treated as they were in the South. Now, most settlers moved west in family groups, often large extended families, and once west, they tried to recreate Eastern society in many ways, establishing the same institutions that they were used to from home. One of the first things virtually any Western settlement did was appoint a sheriff and work to attract a doctor and a school teacher. Settlement of the West tended to fall into three patterns: mining, ranching, and farming. Those who went west focused on mining, gold, again, ranching, which is the origins of the cowboy, and entrepreneurs. Now, I had mentioned earlier part of O'Sullivan's tract here, and that is the idea that going west was part of God's plan. And this goes under, why expand? Why this focus on expansion? Why this focus on manifest destiny? And first of all, again, we have to look at the idea that this was God's plan. The spirit of nationalism encompassed therein. Many at the time viewed America's opportunity in geographic expansion as part of God's plan, that this country was meant to enjoy such advantages. We see this early on with Winthrop and his idea of a city upon a hill, and in the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening with the belief that the U.S. is a chosen land, that God had blessed the growth of the American nation. And we continue to see this a little bit today. Similar to the early Puritans, there was a sense that it was a, quote, divine obligation to stretch the boundaries of the Republic to the Pacific Ocean. But at the time, one reason to expand was because it would simply fulfill God's plan for American greatness. Part two of this was the idea of Christianization. Now, this is going to offend some people, so just be ready. This is something that we'll discuss in a little bit, but one goal was to Christianize those who were not Christian. Later in the 19th century, this would be couched as, quote unquote, Christianizing the savages. And there is some of this at that time too. But again, this idea that those who did not enjoy Christianity were not civilized. And so to civilize them, it was essential to Christianize them. Again, this is going to offend some today, but at the time, this was kind of a general idea, and it was not restricted to the United States. Many Western nations, one of the justifications for imperialism was the idea that they were Christianizing savages, that they were helping to lift them up, this idea of moral uplift. Now, a second reason, cultural superiority. This is similar to the idea of Christianization and the belief that Americans could civilize people in these new areas so that they could broach the culturally superior American mind. Again, yes, this sounds awful today, but history is about context. I'm sure some of you have read some of my writings on this. History is about context, and at this time, that was motivation for many nations with regard to their expansion, and again, the idea to increase empire. The third reason for expansion, slavery. For some, slavery was the key. For some Southerners, they wanted to expand so that they could increase the size of the slave state representatives in Congress. For others, it was an opportunity to bring the non-slave state into the Union, thereby providing more power to the anti-slavery forces. This was obviously not a primary motivation for almost anyone, but this was something that could offer a convincing argument to some. Again, if you are in the South and you want to maintain that balance in Congress, you want to expand so that you can bring more Southern states into the Union, so that you can bring more slave states into the Union, so that your voice as a slave state would not be drowned out by non-slave states. A fourth reason, economic motives. Obviously, new lands provide new markets, new resources, new labor, new opportunity. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 would only increase the desire to move westward. With more land, there was obviously also an opportunity for the landless to gain land, go gain their own property to work and cultivate as they saw fit. These opportunities provided a chance for riches for those who had previously not enjoyed such an option. Thus, economics was a motivator not simply for those who had already succeeded so that they could gain more, but for those who had not had a chance to now garner a chance. And again, we see this with many African Americans before and after the Civil War. Now you may ask yourself, why is Scott drinking a Diet Mountain Dew? Well, I need it. Part two, you may ask yourself, if you're expanding to new lands, what else might be needed to bring economic progress to fruition? Some of the things that you would need: transportation, communication. Technological advances throughout the 19th century would very much facilitate transportation and communication advances. The building of roads, of canals, waterways, railroad, etc. This is all key. And this also connected the nation in an important new way. From the earliest days of the Republic, there were concerns regarding the logistics of a federal democracy so spread out. For example, gaining voting returns, economic data, basic information from such a large swath of land. Each took a long time to go back and forth. In the 1790s, for example, it took a week for news to travel from Virginia to New York City. And it took 3 weeks for a letter to get from Cincinnati to the Atlantic coast. After the Erie Canal would open, letters posted in Buffalo could reach New York City within 6 days and might get to New Orleans within 2 weeks. Quite a difference. Thus, communication also improved, and with it, the sharing of information. Lower printing costs led to a deluge of newspaper and magazine publishers. For example, in 1790, there were 92 newspapers being published in the United States that had a circulation of around 4 million. 45 years later, in 1835, the number of periodicals had risen to 1,258, and circulation surpassed 90 million. In the 1830s, again, further advances in communication, Samuel F.B. Morse began experimenting with the world's first form of electronic communication. The internet, just kidding, the electric telegraph. He developed a code that represented letters of the alphabet, which allowed for long messages to be sent at nearly the speed of light. By 1843, the government began to finance his experimental line from D.C. to Baltimore. His first message was sent May 24th, 1844, and this would revolutionize communication. To us in 2018, or whenever you might watch this, of course, that seems pretty tawdry, pretty plain, but at the time, revolutionary. So now we've talked a little bit about technology. Let's talk about westward expansion. First, we'll start with Texas. Now, when Spain granted independence to Mexico in 1821, the land that is now known as Texas was sparsely populated. The Mexican government actually encouraged settlement by American pioneers. Think about that in the larger context of the Mexican-American War. But again, the Mexican government actually encouraged settlement by American pioneers with the understanding that they would be considered Mexicans and that they would convert to Catholicism. After Mexico outlawed slavery, it expected Texans to follow suit. Mexico also wanted a buffer zone between the Mexican heartland and the Comanche tribe that was a little bit north of Texas. In 1823, Stephen Austin led 300 families onto land granted to his father by the Mexican government. These Texans met none of the conditions that were established by the Mexican government. Still, they did it. 10 years later, in 1833, Austin would journey to Mexico City to meet with dictator Santa Anna to negotiate. Austin would be thrown in jail for 18 months because, again, they were not willing to convert to Catholicism. They did not want to consider themselves Mexicans, and for many of them, they did not want to get rid of slavery, even if the Mexican government had outlawed it on their end. So in 1833, Austin, again thrown in jail for 18 months. In 1835, war would break out between Santa Anna's troops and a group of Texas revolutionaries. March 2nd, 1836, representatives from Texas declared their independence. Shortly thereafter, Santa Anna's troops would lay siege to the Alamo. Maybe you've heard of that. 187 Texans were ultimately crushed by 5,000 plus Mexican troops, which angered many Americans. Many of these Americans would then flock to Texas, and led by a commander named Sam Houston, would defeat Santa Anna's troops. And on May 14th, 1836, Santa Anna recognized Texan independence. Now, Texan independence, of course, many Texans today, hey, hallelujah, right? We've got our independence. At the time, it's a little bit different. But again, this does not mean that Texas is part of the United States yet. But many Texan Americans did want to be annexed by the United States. They feared that the Mexican government may try to recapture their land. Additionally, many of those who had settled in Texas came from the American South and wanted to create a new southern state. But many in the North did not want to allow for a new southern state. Why would that be? For what I had mentioned earlier, it would make it a slave state. Texas is a slave state. That, again, helps the balance in Congress, gives slave states more power. And this is a key part of expansion throughout the 19th century. Obviously, 1820, 1848, 1850, we've got this. So Again, there's a lot going on, but let's get back to this. So, again, we see this desire of many Texan Americans to be annexed by the United States. Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, our old friend, King Andrew, he feared that there would be conflict between the North and South, so he did not pursue annexation. Essentially, he wanted to kick the can down the road. He didn't want to deal with the potential conflict. He didn't want to deal with upsetting some people. So rather than deal with it, he left it up to the next president, which is kind of classic Old Hickory. Texas was thus an independent country. It would fly its Lone Star flag for the next 9 years, but the story is not over. And to be sure, Texas was not the only area out west that many Americans coveted. Let's also talk about the Oregon Territory. Now, the Oregon Territory spanned the modern states of Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, as well as the western coast of Canada up to the border of Russian Alaska. Alaska's not ours yet. Seward's Folly comes a little bit later. Both Great Britain and America claimed this territory. The Treaty of 1818 called for joint occupation of Oregon, which was only a temporary solution. American missionaries and other settlers had poured into the area and had outnumbered British settlers by the late 1830s. Now, Britain was no Mexico. They were not an easy pushover, if you will. They were very much more powerful. They had the strongest navy in the world, and its empire stretched out more than any other empire at the time. But the American people were betwixt by expansion. An Oregon fever swept the nation in the 1840s. Thousands of settlers entered the area, fought Native Americans at times, and at other times received some assistance from other Western tribes. Note, it took 6 months of travel at the speed of 15 miles per day to reach their destination. 6 months. You leave the East, 6 months later, you're in Oregon. I sure hope they liked Oregon. That's a long trip. For those in the East, the issue was much more political. Poor families could not make the trip, so it was less personal for them. But expansion dominated the American zeitgeist, and the election of 1844 would offer proof. Henry Clay, the great compromiser. We've talked about him in the past. He would be the Whig candidate. Democrats nominated a guy named James Polk, an unknown from Tennessee, and, very notable, he was handpicked by King Andrew. Remember, King Andrew, man of the people, promoter of democracy? No. Selected his own successor. So think about that. Now, Clay was insanely popular. He was considered the overwhelming favorite. Polk, for his part, recognized the American mood, and he focused on the idea of geographic expansion. He called for expansion into Texas, into California, and he wanted the entire Oregon Territory. The northern boundary of Oregon was the latitude line of 54 degrees, 40 minutes. The popular slogan for his candidacy would be 54-40 or fight. Somehow, Polk defeated Clay, and he went to work. He declared to Britain that the official joint occupation would end within 1 year. The British were confident that they could win a war, but they were outnumbered in the territory by a number of 6-1 by the year 1846. So, in June of 1846, compromise was reached, with Oregon split at the 49th parallel. And that's where you get that. I mentioned the coast of Canada. Of course, anything north of that will go to Britain. But think about that. Polk comes into office, puts his foot down, says the joint occupation ends. Britain, rather than fight a war, says, all right, we'll cut it in half. You guys take your part, we'll take ours. Pretty significant victory for a new president. Now back to the Southwest, the Lone Star State, and this little state called California, and of course New Mexico. Now immediately prior to becoming president, trouble in Texas resurfaced. The day prior to Polk's inauguration, Congress admitted Texas to the Union in a joint resolution. Mexico was outraged. Plus, there's still this boundary dispute. Mexico viewed the boundary as the Nueces River, which was the Texan boundary while under Mexican rule. Americans, including Polk, viewed the boundary as the Rio Grande River, the territory between the two rivers subject to much argument. But Texas was only part of what Polk envisioned and only part of what he coveted. He also wanted the rich ports of California and desired trade with the Far East that would revolve around San Francisco and Monterey. Great Britain also wanted this land. Now, real quick here, I have to interject that the desire to trade with the Far East, specifically China, has dominated American thought. And again, Polk wants to bring this to a reality by taking California. So Polk sent John Slidell to Mexico. He wanted to offer them $30 million for the Texan boundary at the Rio Grande, New Mexico Territory, and California. The Mexican government was understandably upset. They were insulted, and they refused to even receive Slidell to hear his offer. Polk is angry, and the war is on. In July of 1845, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to advance his troops to the Rio Grande. Mexico viewed this as an invasion. Polk knew that an attack on American forces could force Congress's hand to declare war. We heard this, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, right? So in May of 1846, word was received that the Mexican army had fired on Taylor's soldiers. Polk appeared before Congress. He claimed Mexico had invaded the United States and had, quote, shed American blood on American soil. A little bit of semantics there, but war would be declared, and this is often referred to as Polk's War, and there is an excellent work called Polk's War if you're interested more about this, kind of the vicissitudes and the nastiness that was involved. Now, when war began, the United States Army was a mere 8,000, but soon there were 60,000 volunteers that would join the ranks. The American Navy dominated the sea. The American government was stable and had capable leadership. The economy was expanding and far surpassed that of the Mexican state. Morale was on the United States as well. And the war was a rout. Kind of like Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter. If you're not aware of that, take part 2 of the class. You'll know what I mean. John Fremont and Stephen Kearny were sent to control the coveted California and New Mexico. Fremont led a group of Californians to declare independence even before hostilities had reached the area. The Bear Flag Republic did not garner much immediate respect, but Fremont and followers marched to Monterey to capture the Mexican fort there. And by 1847, California was secure. Kearny led his troops into Santa Fe in August of 46, causing the governor of New Mexico to flee the state. The city was captured without one casualty. Kearny would march his army west across the desert to join Fremont in California. Taylor crossed the Rio Grande, and Winfield Scott invaded Mexico at Veracruz, marched to the capital, Mexico City. So that wasn't too rough. Not everyone, though, was in favor of this war. New Englanders were against this war. Abolitionists were against this war. You can kind of figure out why. And this is where we get Thoreau and his work, Civil Disobedience, and why he went to jail, because he did not want to pay taxes that would support the Mexican-American War. Now, the taxes that he refused to pay were local taxes. They had nothing to do with the Mexican-American War, but Thoreau believed that it was a righteous cause. And so he writes Civil Disobedience, and an American classic is born. So we have this war, right? Kearny is marched. He has met Fremont. They have New Mexico. They have California. And Taylor crosses the Rio Grande. The Americans have actually moved into Mexico City. The war is a rout, and it concludes with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What does this treaty provide? The U.S. received the Texas Territory, as well as New Mexico and California. Altogether, this comprised half of Mexican territory. The Mexican government was paid $15 million, which was the same that we gave France for the Louisiana Territory. Now, remember, we had offered them $30 million, and they had to settle for $15 million. So again, we take Texas, New Mexico, California. The Mexican government is paid $15 million, and the West is won.